Yeah, no, you're fine. Ghost walks did go well last night.
Good.
I almost had 0 people for my second tour.
And am I doing okay? Not too nervous?
I think so.
Yeah, I mean, I know you were on your tours, but like...
Before you guys leave, would you fill
I
out
think
one of
so.
those
I mean,
program slips?
other than when she made eye contact with one of the men whose wives was twerking on him. Twerking on him? Oh, they were drunk. They were wasted.
I did warn her that she was nervous, so I was like,
It was at, yeah, it was at Tar House. There was just, I know who it was because I talked to one of them. She was asking me questions. So loudly she was asking me questions. And I only had 4 people. I'm like, oh my God, they cannot hear this story. Yeah, one person that had signed up for for the 7:45, they came in late. They were only a couple minutes late. And then there was a couple that was supposed to be on, because Emma went after me. They were supposed to be on her 8 o'clock tour, but they decided to come with me. She goes, thank you for that. I'm like, no problem. Because she ended up having 11. She goes, that was a good, oh no, our first 2 were huge. They were so big.
You know, she does well on the pressure, so we're right into the fire.
Yeah. My first group, the woman brought a baby. That baby was quiet the whole time. She goes, yeah, Dad decided he couldn't take care of 2 kids. I'm just like, that annoyed me. But she was very nice. She did. It was a quiet baby. Her and her friends came in afterwards and said, thank you so much. That was really great. I'm like, oh, you're welcome. So they were, my first group I really, really liked. My second group, one of the guys kept like walking like right next to me and like trying to walk ahead of me. And I'm thinking, sir, I guide you, my man.
Apparently. Just a conversation.
What?
Is it a couple guys?
Late morning. I think I came down Craig Street and went
She
completely
can't hear me, can she?
That's what
all
I'm
the way
wondering.
down here. Off
I mean, it's not like they were saying anything bad.
I was just saying there were people.
It took like 15 minutes and everything.
Oh no, she was hearing you.
I knew what it was going to be. Yeah. I know. But there's schedule. Holy schedule.
But it's not playing.
It's not. But if the live stream started, or like, even if it's ready.
It's the audio. But not
That's
the
what,
video.
so there's no audio, because she didn't know it was you. But captions, it's captioning what you're saying. And it's giving captions on all the, like on the screen.
I know. I got to plan my whole day.
Yeah, I don't know.
Spring on campus and we had the athletic meeting and shoot it. Yeah. Okay, we get started now.
All right, how are you guys today? All right, my name is Ashley Sayers. I'm the education manager at the Rogers Historical Museum, and this is my coworker, Jennifer Kick. She is the collections manager at the Rogers Historical Museum. And today we're going to be talking about Victorian mourning practices. They mourned a little bit differently than we do today, so I'm going to just go over some of those customs that they had during the Victorian era. And then we also brought some objects from our collections that you guys are more than welcome to come up and look at after the program. You can't touch because they are actual collections objects, but you are more than welcome to come up and look and ask us questions. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, now it's not going to want to work. There we go. All right, so in today's world, our life expectancy much longer, and mortality rates for babies and young children is much lower. But in the Victorian era, that was not the case. Now, because they were dealing with death on a more frequent basis, The Victorians had strict customs and etiquette that they followed when observing the passing of an individual, just as a way to show their respect. From how the funeral was conducted to the attire that one wore during the mourning period, superstitions that they had surrounding death, and more. We're going to talk about all those and how they mourned. All right. So first we're going to talk about some societal customs. For Victorians, when it came time to mourn the death of a loved one, both men and women visibly mourned, but the etiquette they followed was much more strict for the women. It was the women that primarily oversaw the funeral practices and the mourning customs that was observed by the whole family. And everything had to be perfect according to the societal expectations of the time. If a woman began to socialize too early, if she didn't wear the appropriate color, or if she provided cards that had the wrong size of black border around it, that could all be seen as disrespect for the dead. Now, when you were going to alert society to the death of someone, it would start with your door at home. The front door of your home could be adorned with a black crepe badge, as you see in that picture on the left. Having a badge on the door, it was universally understood that a death had occurred in the family. And you would also use a funeral notice to help spread word of a death. The funeral notice, it would let you know not only that someone had passed, but when the funeral would be. Inside the home, the family would shut the blinds, shutters, and drapes. That was also a way to alert people that the family inside the home were in mourning. Now, once word of a death had spread, family and friends would pay condolence calls to the family. They would bring food, such as meat, pies, cakes, breads, among other things, not much different than we do today. This food that they brought, it was a huge help to the family that was in mourning, especially for the women, because they would have been the ones in charge of preparing all of the meals. It meant that they didn't have to worry about cooking everything while they were preparing for the upcoming funeral, as well as any food that they might need after the funeral, when people would gather for a post-funeral meal, especially if they had family coming in from out of town. So that was just one less thing that they had to worry about. Now, we're also going to talk about their attire, because it wasn't just a simple wearing black clothes. They had accessories as well, and they would wear their mourning attire and their mourning accessories for much longer than we do today. And again, all the guidelines mostly apply to the women in the Victorian era. Your mourning attire would be determined by how much time had passed since someone had died, and how close you were with the deceased. The closer you were, the deeper you mourned. That would determine what you were wearing. So if a woman was in deep mourning, she would wear a black dress like the one you see in the picture. It would be free of shine and heavily trimmed in crepe. Now, because silk crepe became discolored very quickly and could start smelling, deep mourning attire was called widow's weeds. From black, you would graduate to a deep purple, which is that color strip at the top, or we also call it mauve. Then from there, you would go to a lavender color, or you could wear clothes with a black and white pattern on them, like if they were striped. Mourning could last a full year for women. Some did choose to mourn for the rest of their lives, like Queen Victoria did, after Prince Albert had passed away. She ended up being in mourning for 40 years, so for the rest of her life. Now, men, on the other hand, they didn't have as much for their attire that they had to worry about, since they tended to wear black normally every day anyway. It was common to see men wearing crepe hat bands or armbands, especially if they were part of the funeral service. Men also didn't have to mourn as long as women either. They would usually only mourn up to 6 months, maybe even less. When it came to children, they were not typically put in mourning attire because it wasn't seen as good for their health or their spirits. They didn't want children to be melancholy. So if they did put them in any sort of mourning attire, it would be white clothing like you see in this picture of these young girls. They would have black sashes or armbands or dark velvet trimmings, which you can see on the girl on the far right. So much different than when we are getting dressed to mourn and go to a funeral today. Now, funerals, they've also changed quite a bit since then. Funerals during the Victorian era were generally held in the home. And everything that was needed was brought by the undertaker. So you would lay the body out in the front parlor of the home. You would either have the body in a coffin, which was 8-sided and tapered, or in a casket, which was rectangular. And they would place that on a bier, which you can kind of see right. Oh, I don't think that's going to work. It's not. But if you look at the picture with the coffin, you'll see the black legs. That's a bier. It's just kind of like a just wooden stand with legs on there. The coffin or casket, it would be covered with tassels and swags of black fabric. You'd also have chairs set up around the coffin or casket for those whose duty it was to set up with the dead. It was a Southern practice that had been started to keep the body free of flies. Of course, that tradition goes back much farther than that. After embalming became a standard practice for funerals, sitting with the dead became more a sign of showing respect for the person that had passed on than making sure flies stayed off of the body. That being said, though, even embalming was done in the home. So the undertaker would bring a portable cooling table, and we brought one of those with us today. So they'd bring a portable cooling table. They'd bring all of the equipment that they needed to prepare the body, which you see in that picture up there on the left. And we also have a bottle of fluid that they would have used for embalming. By the early 1900s, though, funerals were increasingly held in the undertaker's establishment, and it was called the funeral parlor after the front parlors of the home where funerals had previously been held. Now, because funeral parlors started being called funeral parlors, it was decided that we should not call the front parlor a parlor anymore because it was associated with death. So that is where we get the term living room. We wanted it to be associated more with life rather than death. And these two pictures up here, this was a pretty prominent funeral home in Rogers. Is from the Callison Funeral Home. So the picture on the left is from the chapel inside, and the picture on the right is the hearse that he used, and it was one of the first motorized hearses that we had. So it was a pretty big deal, and it's sitting in front of his undertaking business that you see in that picture. Flowers were also very important. We still will send flowers today, but in the Victorian era, they would have had even more meaning because Victorians used flowers to say different things. So when you were sending flowers to a funeral, you had to be very careful about the kind a flower you were sending, because if you sent the wrong kind of flower, it could very much send the absolute wrong message. So flowers, or they were also called floral tributes, they were an important custom. Traditionally, you would have arrangements in the shape of an anchor like this one, or a cross, and that signified hope. Among some of the flowers that you'd see in funeral arrangements, you'd have lilies, which represent purity, life, remembrance, and rebirth. If a funeral was being held for someone who lived, I thought I had a different picture. If you had a funeral that was held for someone that had lived a long life, which would have been kind of rare in those times, they did signify that. In the picture on the left, it's a little hard to see, but I can go back later if you guys want to get a better look at the end. They would get a sheaf of wheat, and they would tie it with black ribbon, and they would set that on the coffin or the casket. So that was just a way to signify that the person that had passed had lived a long life and that they weren't young. Now, if the deceased had been part of a fraternal organization, such as the Masons, there could be floral tributes that were in the shape of the symbols of that organization. All right. We're also going to talk about remembrances. There were a lot of ways that the Victorians remembered the loved ones that had passed on. So we have things like mourning jewelry, hair wreaths, photos of the dead, and memorial cards. Those were all common practice. So taking photos of the deceased, usually it was a mother or the parents with a child holding them. It was a final way to memorialize your deceased loved one. You'd also have photos of living siblings posing with their sibling that had passed away. It didn't matter who was in the photo with them, though. The deceased would always be dressed, their hair would be styled, and they would be posed to look as if they were still alive. Sometimes in the pictures you'll see they will have closed eyes, and they'll be shown just like that, their eyes are closed, but sometimes their eyes would be painted on to make it look like they were still alive. And sometimes this would be the only photo that a family had of the loved one that had passed away, since during that time we weren't taking pictures quite as much as we are now, so that could be the only photo that they have. Another way to memorialize a loved one that had passed away is with a hair wreath, and we have that in the picture on the left. This is actually a hair wreath that we have at the Rogers Historical Museum. It's in our historic house that we can give guided tours of. So hair wreaths, they were made using real hair. It was hair from the deceased, as well as living family members too. The hair would be wrapped around a wire form that was sometimes in the shape of a horseshoe, and it would be displayed with the open end at the top. So that would be pointing towards heaven. The wreath would be mounted on a fabric background and placed in a shadow box for display. A lot of hair wreaths could be quite large. It could be 18 inches or more in diameter. So they were not small things, the hair wreaths. Similarly, we have mourning jewelry that was made from the deceased's hair, and we have some examples of that up here that you guys can look at the end. Some examples of mourning jewelry would include a brooch, bracelets, earrings, rings. So these pieces would be worn during the mourning period. When I was doing research for this program, I found a really, just kind of a really nice quote that said, "The imperishable nature of human hair and the great brilliancy and beauty which it retains long after it has been severed, even after the person to whom it once belonged has passed away, have always rendered it one of the most cherished mementos of absent or departed friends." So really, hair art, whether it was jewelry or the hair wreaths, it was an enduring way to express one's love for a friend or a family member. And another remembrance that we're going to talk about is a little less macabre to our standards today would be memorial cards. So they were typically supplied to the grieving family by the undertaker. They'd be printed in black and silver on white and embossed with traditional symbols of grief like the inverted torch, a weeping willow, kneeling female mourners, and even a shrouded urn. The card could also contain the name and the age of the person who had passed, the date and place of burial, as well as possibly a verse or some other text. You can see in this picture, it has the name of the person that passed, the day they were born, the day they died, how old they were. It doesn't have the funeral date, but it does have a verse at the bottom. The cards would be mounted and then framed to be put on display in the home of the bereaved. They were intended to be a reminder to offer prayers for the dead and for the family that had lost their loved one. And the last thing we're going to talk about is the superstitions. There we go. That the Victorians had. So some of the superstitions, if not all of them, they influenced some of the customs that they followed. There were many, but two were very common. So it was customary to stop all of the clocks in the house at the time of death of the deceased and not to restart them until after the funeral. Superstition held that if the clocks were restarted immediately, it would lead to another death. So they didn't want that to happen, so they did not start those clocks right away. The bereaved family would also drape fabric all over all the mirrors in the home, and we have an example of that here. This was tied to two different superstitions. One superstition said that if the casket was reflected in a mirror, that it would lead to another death. And then the other superstition said that if a person saw their own reflection in a mirror soon after a death in the family, that it would lead to their own death. So all the superstitions are tied to, if you don't do this, another death is going to happen. And since they were kind of surrounded by death already anyway, they definitely did not want that to happen. This one's just kind of an interesting little one. I didn't know how to really fit it in here, but when I was researching, I found an article in our files that was talking about superstitions in the Ozarks, and one of them was if you put pawpaw seeds in a murder victim's grave and bury it with them, that will help to catch the murderer. So I thought that was a really interesting one. I don't know why they chose pawpaw seeds out of all the other seeds, but that was the one that they chose. So I thought that was really interesting. The customs and beliefs surrounding death for the Victorians has evoked the terms of cult of death and cult of mourning, and indeed, the Victorians were seen as more macabre than we are today as a society. But every mourning practice or custom that they had during the Victorian era, it had a reason and a meaning behind it, and it was a product of their societal views of the day, just like our mourning practices are results of our societal views in the 21st century. So lots changed. Although we do keep some of them, we still bring food to people who have lost a loved one. Some do still wear black to funerals. I know that's becoming a little less of a requirement now, though. So do you guys have any questions? Something that I talked about that you want to know more about? Yes.
Did the traditions you follow depend on like your wealth or like status?
I don't think so. I mean, did she wanted to know if the traditions or the customs they followed depended on their wealth or their status. I didn't see anything that really said anything about that. I mean, wealthier people may have been able to have maybe a little bit more elaborate things, but I think it was just a normal, like straight across the board. I could be wrong, but I didn't see anything. Do you guys have any other questions?
Is there a reason specifically why like crepe fabric was the fabric that they went towards to use for like symbolism in that way? Like I don't know, it seemed weird that kept popping up throughout all the different like wares.
Right. So I'm repeating for the live stream. So she asked if there was a reason for crepe fabric being used. I don't know. I didn't see anything in that. But it was just, it was a silky fabric and a transparent fabric. So you had to wear a lot, especially for your clothes. So it could have just had to do with layers too. Because I wouldn't want to wear a lot of heavy layers. But I also didn't live in the 1800s, so, you know, different things. But yeah, I didn't see anything in my research. I am no help to you guys in your questions. I am so sorry. Yes.
People would lay bodies on those tables. It doesn't look like those legs are super sturdy. You think that if someone would sit on it hard enough, it might just like come out from under them, you know?
Yeah, so he was asking or saying that the legs on the cooling table don't look super sturdy. They are though. I mean, they have a locking mechanism in place. Jen, do you want me to tell, or I didn't know if you were gonna say more.
I find my gloves, I can come push on it. It's not bad.
Yeah, it's not, because we were putting it together. I mean, I don't have my gloves on, but once you lock them in place, they don't go anywhere.
And people were shorter and smaller.
Generally, yeah. Yeah, generally people were a little shorter. Not always. So the pictures that we had, or that I had in here of in the house, so that's from our historic home that we have, the Hawkins House, at the Rogers Historical Museum. And we've done tours in the past where we talk about the morning practices. And the man that lived in the Hawkins House during that time period, F.C. Hawkins, he was actually a pretty tall man. So you always had those exceptions. But yeah, I think generally they were shorter. Are there any other questions? All right, well, thank you guys so much. And if you come up and look at this stuff and there's any other pictures that you want to get a closer look at, I can flip back in the PowerPoint. But thank you guys so much for joining us today. And please come and visit us at the Rogers Historical Museum. We're in downtown Rogers on the corner of 2nd Street and Cherry Streets. We always say we're by Las Palmas. It's a really good Mexican restaurant. People know where Las Palmas is, so it's easy for us to tell them we're just down the street from there. All right, thank you guys.
Thank you.
I'm afraid to say anything.